Hello, my name is Sean Osborne, and welcome to the Black Patriots of Lexington. Lexington, Massachusetts, the birthplace of liberty, the site of the first armed conflict of the American Revolution. Lexington, the home of black residents since it was known as Cambridge Farms. Some of those black residents owned property and paid taxes. Others were enslaved or indentured. Many of them played vital roles in the founding of the United States of America. Today, we'll explore the life and time of Adam Tidd, a black patriot who was living in Lexington on April 19, 1775, and was a soldier during the American Revolution. Our guide in this exploration is Dr. William Poole. Hi, Bill. How are you?
Fine, John. How are you?
Great, thanks. So, when I think about what's going on in 1775, I think about this idea that we have people in Lexington who are at the vanguard to fight for liberty from the King of Britain. At the same time, we have these tax records that show that 6 families have enslaved people. So this Tidd family, were they part of that?
The tax records are definite. They show if there was an enslaved person in the house, they might not be named, but in Lexington, a lot of times they were named. So it would show the property owner. It would show an individual who was owned as property at the time. And there was a young man named Adam who lived in the Tidd household. And he had been purchased as a slave, supposedly at the age of 3, a young man at the age of 3.
Just a child.
Just a child, yeah. And he lived, in essence, until he was an adult in that household.
So you found the bill of sale.
Yes, we found the bill of sale, and if I might quote a bit from it here, it says, detailing the sale to Daniel Tidd of Lexington, quote, of a Negro boy named Adam being about 3 years of age. So very young children were sold, bartered, and so forth at that time. And this is a part of Lexington's history that in many ways has been forgotten, that blacks had played a part in Lexington history right from the very beginning.
And so you have this child in the 1750s, and he's purchased by Daniel Tidd, I believe, from Woburn. Is that right?
Yes.
All right, from Woburn, just next door.
Yep, that's correct. Yeah.
And so we have this interplay between Woburn and Lexington and the slave trade. But so at 3 years old, would he have been in the tax records, or not until he gets to be 16?
That's correct. Yeah, not until they're 16 they just listed it all, which I guess is fortuitous for people who didn't have to claim property for tax purposes.
Right, right. So now we get to 1775. At that point, is Adam Tidd still enslaved by Daniel Tidd, or has something happened?
What has happened, and we see this in the will of Daniel Tidd, that he was transferred or willed to his son, William. So he is now a slave of William. And in fact, in the earlier tax records, they were co-owners. So that both Daniel and William were co-owner of Adam. And then when Daniel died, William owned Adam.
Okay. So William Tidd, that's Lieutenant William Tidd, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, right. Member of the Lexington Militia.
Okay, so how did he end up being a lieutenant?
Usually it was picked as a man who had either military experience before or was just a person in the company who was in the town, I should say, who was well respected. That is also true of Captain John Parker, who may have had military experience. The records aren't quite clear there, but he was certainly a well-respected man and well-read. He also borrowed books from Reverend Jonas Clark, so we know that he was a reader, a man of intelligence. So I would say there's a well-respected man who then was chosen. He was elected captain of the militia.
And that was for a 1-year term?
Usually 1-year term. Sometimes they would carry on year after year.
Okay. So Lieutenant William Tidd, an enslaver, he's there on the green on April 19. Were there others in the company who also were enslavers?
Yes, there were others. I can't give you the names right now, I'm sorry, but there were at least one or two more who were slave owners. And the interesting point, of course, which you'll get to later perhaps, is there was an enslaved man on the common at that time.
Right. So in fact, that's exactly where we're going next is on April 19, 1775, Adam Tidd is over 16, so he is eligible to be part of the militia. He's enslaved, so similar to Prince Estabrook, he could have responded to the alarm. He did not. What's your thought on why or why not that did not happen with Adam?
A very interesting question, because there were over 200 members of the militia, and yet we have a small number, somewhere between 77 and 83, who were on or about the common at that time. Some, in fact, when the firing was started, were still coming on the common. So getting the numbers straight and exactly who was there is a challenge. Why he might not have been there, he probably had duties at home, and with William away, Adam then would probably have served as the man of the house, quote unquote.
Was he the only enslaved male in the Tidd household, or were there
Yes,
others?
he was the only one.
Okay. Were there any women, or just as
Adam
far as we
is the
know?
only one that we know of. The
Okay.
property records and tax records indicate that he is the only one.
And what was William Tidd's role on the green that morning?
Well, William would have been in command of a certain portion. Captain Parker would have been out in front, and then the officers could have been behind or at the ends of the line, the flanks of the company, establishing control or maintaining control of that group.
And so would Adam have helped William get ready for that, or would he have just done that by himself? Would he have been a body man, so to speak, for William?
It's hard to say. I really don't know. Okay. Enslaved persons certainly were there at beck and call, and anything that needed to be done. His wife was there. William's wife was there as well too. So we don't know how much preparation. This is another point. We don't know how much preparation they could take, because the appearance of the British was sudden, because they had kind of lost track of where they were. Scouts were sent out, but they didn't find anyone, and it was just within a few minutes that the last scout came back to report. They're right down. They were a quarter of a mile away here, and they're coming fast. So a lot of people just ran onto the common. William, being some ways away, might have stayed in Buckman's Tavern or at one of the houses alongside the green, and then would have just rolled out as quickly as they could to get into formation.
And that's. Thank you for mentioning that, because I want to pull back and to make sure that I understand the timeline. So Paul Revere comes in, goes to the parsonage.
That's correct.
And then comes to the tavern.
That's correct.
And then the alarm is sounded.
Yes.
Okay.
And at that time, Revere could look out the window of the tavern and see the British just down the road. So it was a precipitous event for those, because they were still in the tavern sitting there at the time, and others in the houses nearby, and some probably standing around in the common. So it was very quickly, the rider came in. Captain Parker ordered the drummer, William Diamond, to beat the alarm, and the bells would ring later on, and on would come the British, and the men tumbled out of the tavern, dashed onto the common, and got into a sort of a regular formation, two lines. But as I say, others were still coming into formation at the time. So when the regulars, as you look at what it was like at the time, there was a big meeting house, and then Buckman's Tavern, and a sort of narrow road in between. And it was quite dark, about 6 o'clock in the morning. So when the regulars are peering down there, seeing this formation, they look like soldiers standing in line, and they say, wait a minute now.
Right.
We're not going to let those people stand here. So 3 companies move towards the common very quickly and take up formation.
And so you mentioned William Diamond. So William Diamond is apprenticed to Fessenden down what is now known as East Lexington.
That's correct.
So how does he end up so quickly to the Greens? He seems to be further away than.
Well, I think that he was there at the time.
Okay.
When a person rode in from Boston saying, "There are no British. I've ridden all the way from Boston." Of course, he came another way, and at that time, Captain Parker said, "Well, dismiss the company, but stay nearby and attend to the sound of the drum." So he would have kept the drummer with him. I think that usually musicians of any sort, drummers, fifers, would have stayed pretty close to the commanding officer so that they could sound any type of a call that was necessary.
And then you visited. We visited together, actually, what we believe to be the Adam Tidd and William Tidd household. Where is that?
Yes, well, that's an interesting story in itself, if you'd like me to go into that now or not. We were trying to locate just where would Adam have lived and William Tidd house. And fortunately, there are historic maps going back to the 1850s and so forth that locate that house. And so you can almost measure on the map and find out where that was. And so I then examined property records to see how the house was transferred from William Tidd to his son, and then so on. And so by doing that, you can actually locate precisely which house it is.
And so this house is located near what's now called Diamond Middle School, is that right?
Yes, yes.
All right, excellent. But we don't have any sense of where he may have stayed on the grounds.
No, there certainly were outbuildings and so forth. I am going to presume that he would have stayed somewheres in the house. Whether he had a separate room himself or what, I don't know.
And that was typical at the time.
It's usually the enslaved would stay upstairs, perhaps in an attic area or an upstairs area, which would later times would be called a servants area.
And their responsibilities for enslaved people in Lexington would be general labor support.
Yeah, actually, they would not only work around the house, but they'd work in the fields alongside the men of the house and so forth, performing any of the tasks that needed to be done.
Do you have a sense of how much property William Tidd had at the time?
I can't give you that acreage. I probably could look it up for you, Sean, but I'm going to say that it was probably less than 100 acres.
Okay.
You needed close to 100 acres to have a farm that was self-maintenance, where you would have a woodlot, you would have fields for grazing of cattle, and you would have others for raising crops. And you might have a rotation of crops, one crop in 1 year here and another there, and then switch them the following year. So between woodlots and grazing land and tillage, and then usually a garden around the house and so forth for certain vegetables and herbs. Probably 100 acres would be a nice sized farm.
And when managing and operating that farm, you would have both, in this case with William Tidd, you would have the support of Adam Tidd, and then you might have other non-black labor support, and then you might also either with the free or black residents also hire them on, or how would that work?
That's possible. No, Adam had a brother, so that there could have been a division of labor there as well. At times, what happened in those days, it was called a barter economy, whereas instead of exchanging money, you exchanged tasks or jobs. Mm-hmm. And I might make a chair for you, and you in return might make equipment for my wagon or something like that. And then at the end of the year, they'd balance everything up. And at that time, you'd exchange a little bit of money depending on who owed whom. So they didn't have a lot of money, and it wasn't, I would say, really a money-based economy. It was what was, as I said, a barter-based economy.
You mentioned Adam's brother.
Yeah.
Do you know much about him?
No, I do not know that he had a house right beside William's.
Sorry, William's brother, not Adam's brother.
Excuse me. I meant William had a brother.
Thank you, yes.
William's brother had a house right beside. He has built, we think, around 1810, specifically for him. I think that house is still there, just down the road from William's house.
And so that would be, so David Tidd had at least two sons. Mm-hmm. And they stayed in the area. So then he would have had a larger land that he didn't split between his sons upon his...
Yeah, this is the story of Lexington, is the division of land. They had large families and certainly many sons. And they could not, all the land had been taken up, usually by 1775, all the land had been taken up, the arable land. And so each generation would move a distance away, 13 to 23 miles or something like that, because they just could not maintain an entire family on that small acreage.
Right. So that, in terms of family, so now moving back to Adam, so Adam is in the William Tidd household. We have the Battle of Lexington and Concord on April 19. What then does he do? Does he end up enlisting right away? Or does he end up enlisting later on?
He enlisted in May, just a month later.
Okay.
And he's in for several years at different companies and so forth. I have a list here and so forth that where he was, he belonged to several companies. He went up to the Northern Army to enforce General Gates up around Ticonderoga at one time, enlisting there for a few months. And it's interesting because there's an entry in Charles Hudson's History of Lexington that talks about William Tidd and others providing money for a man to go on that campaign. And we really believe that that is Adam, which would reinforce the record that he was gone to Ticonderoga at the time. And it says service under General Gates, so that both of those kind of reinforced the fact that Adam was up there.
And at that point, you said there's £9 that was set aside?
Yeah.
Did that money go to Adam or to William, or can you tell from the records?
That goes to the community, really. There's money that's paid, and that then the community in many times was responsible for helping get the equipment for their soldiers and such, or they would pay them a bounty and such. Now, if Adam was still enslaved at that point, it would not go to him. It might, but since it was given by William, we think it probably went to the town for supplies and so forth, equipment.
Okay. And so then he serves until 76, 77, is that about right?
Yeah, 77, and then, if I may refer to another, he is still in there at 78, in 1778. He's detached to guard and fortify posts at and around Boston. So he's in from 75 to 78, as far as we know, as the record goes.
So 3 years of service, and as was typical at the time, it wasn't continuous.
Correct.
He then ends up on the tax records, paying poll tax, which is what's required of a free man, with or without land, living in town. So we can presume that he has been manumitted by 78.
We don't know how he won his freedom, if it was just simply because of service. I've not found any manumission papers, and I don't even know if they exist for these soldiers, the black soldiers. But certainly by, he's listed as, quote, a free Negro in the census records. So this is 1790 and so forth. So by that time, he had become free.
And that was important with the census, is that so pre-1790, you were listed either as a freeman and you had land, or you just paid a poll tax, or if you were enslaved on the one pager, you were just a number, a tally mark.
Correct. Yeah.
In 1790, they had an option for enslaved or free Negro.
Yes.
And so that's how we know that either through his service or through the Supreme Court, well, what's now called the court decision in 1783, that he was now a free man.
Yeah.
So then what happens to him? Does he get married? Does he have children?
Yes,
what does he end up
does.
doing? Okay.
Well, he moves on to Brookline and then to Milford, and he stays several years in Milford, and he marries a Holder Wallace in 1785. Mm-hmm. And their first child was born in 1785, later on in April and their second son was baptized in Boston, and their daughter Eliza as well. Porter is their second son, and you can talk about him a little bit because he's a very interesting individual.
Okay.
Eliza was in 1778, and Dudley, their last son, was born in Boston in 1792. So he's moved from Lexington to either Brookline and then to Milford and then into Boston. And you can find out where he lived in Boston because now he's on the census records and so forth. So you can see him through 1790, 1810, 1820, and so forth, and locate him there. Adam dies in, 1817.
Right.
And of what is called slow fever. I'm not quite sure what that is. If we had one of our company here who plays our doctor and so forth, Sam Foreman, he could tell you exactly what the corresponding diagnosis would be today. So he lived to a pretty good age. We're not quite sure. They say 71, which is a little bit at odds with the record of being free when he was sold. But he lived at least until his late 60s.
So in 1817 is when he died, is that correct?
Yeah.
So at that point, is he a pensioner? Is he getting money for his service, or how is he supporting himself and his family? What does it say in the census in terms of what's he doing?
I don't have an occupation for him, but he certainly wasn't getting a pension from the United States. Blacks who were enslaved could not get a pension. That's an interesting, because they were property at the time. So when they came into the service, they didn't give free service. It was considered, even though they did, and then they served honorably, many throughout the entire war, and yet they couldn't get a pension.
So it was possible, as Dr. Green says in the Negro in Colonial New England, he talks about how during the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War, that enslaved people, depending on their enslaver, could either get paid nothing, get half of their salary, or get all of their salary.
Right.
But they, regardless if they were enslaved throughout their period of service, would get no pension.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It just carries on that way right through the Revolution.
But I find it interesting that their enslavers, similar to Fessenden with William Diamond, they got paid full rate.
Right.
Didn't matter where it went to, but you got paid full rate. So that's the other irony of that time.
Yes, and I'm not sure whether the individuals, it was a gift of the quote-unquote master owner to give that individual half or full, but it usually would go directly to the master, and then perhaps he gave a portion of it.
Right. But so then without any support from his former enslaver, without any support from the government, he then raises his family. I think he's married twice, is that right?
That is correct,
Right.
yes.
So he has these children, then he has a son, Porter. So what can you tell you about Porter, the musician?
Yeah, Porter is a very interesting individual. Porter was a caller for a cotillion, as they call it, which we would call a square dance today, where you would have various prescribed steps and so forth. And he became very well known throughout both in the immediate Boston area and throughout the coast of Massachusetts. There are records of him appearing in Salem to do callings there and so forth. And when he died in 1833, if I might
Sure.
look at this too, his death was noted in the Boston Atlas and received wide circulation, appearing in many newspapers such as the Boston Liberator, the New Hampshire Gazette, the Alexandria Gazette in Alexandria, Virginia, the Eastern Argus in Portland, Maine, the Kentucky Gazette in Lexington, Kentucky, and the Weekly Raleigh Register in Raleigh, North Carolina. So this was an individual who had attained some fame as a result of his musicianship and of his being able to call these dances, and widely requested, I guess you'd say.
Right, and so do we know where he's buried in Boston, or we just know that he was?
I don't know right now where he is buried in Boston, but it may even be in the old burial ground, but I'm not absolutely certain of that. I don't want to make a bald-faced statement of that.
So in the Tidd family, we have someone who was sold in the 1750s in Lexington. In the 1770s, is a witness, and then is a soldier, and then in the 80s and 90s and to 1817, he is a citizen, a father, a husband, and then his son goes on to be known throughout New England.
Yeah, an interesting side here is that Porter was listed as one of only 7 black voters in Boston. So he has the franchise at that time.
Now, if I remember correctly, one of the things that both was true in colonial and Massachusetts Bay Colony, and then with the Commonwealth, is that there was a certain amount of property that you had to have to actually be able to vote.
That's
and
correct.
It had to be tax-free.
That's correct.
So, do you remember what it was in pre-75, in colonial times?
I don't.
Okay.
But I do know that when John Adams wrote the Constitution for Massachusetts, the amount of property was increased that you had to have, and this in part led to some rebellions and so forth throughout the colony. And the legislature then lowered it again until it takes a long time before property requirements are done away with, so that just being an inhabitant allows you to vote.
Right, and that's the interesting, again, part about the pluses and minuses of colonial versus the state, in that you have someone like Philip Burdew of Lexington, who with his 40 acres, taxes fully paid, is a member of town meeting,
yes.
Required member of town meeting.
Yes.
On the other hand, you then have a veteran and many other folks without the property in the post-Revolutionary War who aren't able to vote, whether they're black or white.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the enfranchisement is not guaranteed when we talk about freedom.
No, it's not, and it takes, as you know, forever to And that's been a struggle in American history, is the inclusion of all as citizens. And we know that there was still, even after slavery was done away with in Massachusetts, people were still being held enslaved sort of secretly and stuff and had to sue for their freedom. So it's a long, long process in American history.
Right, and one of the things that was interesting about the abolition of slavery in 1783 then became the, what does that really mean? So if you were enslaved in Connecticut or New Hampshire or Rhode Island and it was still legal there, then that did not mean that once you were, just because you were residing in Massachusetts, that you were free, and that caused some concern among households. Yeah. But it also was a lot of legal cases.
Yes.
that go on, and so it's a complicated portion. But back to the freedom side. You've studied post-Civil War, yes, Black culture. So talk a little bit about your studies and how you got into this to be our guide.
I attended the University of Chicago, where I received my PhD, and John Hope Franklin was my major professor.
The esteemed John Hope Franklin.
The esteemed and wonderful man who became a dear friend. And I became very, very interested in Black history, principally because Black history had been just left out in many ways. And it was Black historians, starting at the turn of the century and so forth, who brought attention to the fact that Blacks had been a part of American history right from the very beginning. And so I was intrigued by that. And since I was a Civil War and Reconstruction major, I became interested in what happened to Blacks during the Civil War and then in the post-war Reconstruction period. And that was sort of my forte at the time, where I spent most of my time. And my dissertation was on Civil War and Reconstruction, and how newspapers related the Black experience and how they felt about Blacks. And it's a very, very interesting theme. And this was in Chicago, and I could follow the newspapers and see what was their opinion of Blacks. And if you were a Democratic newspaper, you were anti-Black and anti-abolition. If you're a Republican newspaper, you were the opposite. And then when a little bit later on, after the war, one of the Republican newspapers decides that it doesn't like the Republican Party that's established and what they're doing, so it turns to anti-Reconstruction and begins talking about Blacks as if they're what the Democrats did during the Civil War. So the nature of Blacks in the eyes of whites is framed by what that white opinion is at the time. And that's always been through history in the United States. And politics has a great deal to do with it. Society has a great deal to do with it. Religion has a lot to do with it. So I just became fascinated and saw how the Reconstruction period started so hopefully and ended so tragically, with Blacks being returned in the South pretty much to the status that they were prior to emancipation.
Thank you. And that's that accordion of being able to be fully engaged politically, economically, and socially for Black folks in America. And I thank you for sharing the story of Adam Tidd. And I think you mentioned that you found out about Adam Tidd through a William Tidd relative?
Yes. I've got an email message from Nathan Tidd from California, who was researching the Tidd family. He's not related to William Tidd, he's related to the other Tidds. But in his research, which was very good, he's not an historian, but as you know, some really good history can come from non-historians. And he found that, bill of sale of Adam to Daniel Tidd, and tried to find out more about Adam from then on. And he identified more or less where the house was, but he wasn't quite sure. So he and I then worked cooperatively to try to further the history of both the house and Adam's history thereafter. So we identified where the house was, and as you know, you are responsible for having to put there a marker actually celebrating Adam's living at that home.
Thank you, and I thank you for bringing your expertise from your time from University of Chicago to bear here in Lexington.
Well, it's my pleasure, Sean.
So I hope that you are inspired to learn more about the Black Patriots of Lexington and the other Black Patriots of the Revolutionary War. These men and women were heroes and founders of our great nation, the United States of America. Till next time, I'm Sean Osborne, and thank you to the researchers and curators who make this program possible, and to the Association of Black Citizens of Lexington, the Community Endowment Lexington, LexMedia, and Tricons to Red Tails.